Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in every life when logic meets emotion, when equations blur, and the human heart writes its own algorithms. For me, that intersection has always been fascinating. We can chart the trajectories of rockets, design neural interfaces, simulate galaxies, yet we still struggle to decode something as simple and as complex as love. What does love look like to the mind that builds machines? What happens when a person driven by logic and invention begins to feel something that refuses to obey the rules of physics? Tonight I want to take you into a worldview talk about the quiet universe that exists inside emotion, thought, and human connection. The hidden letters we write not on paper, but inside neurons. The kind that never get mailed, yet shape every decision we make. When we talk about love, people think of hearts and poetry, but scientifically it's a chemical symphony: oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, molecules dancing in precise yet unpredictable rhythms. The human brain is, in a sense, the most advanced communication network in existence. But when it comes to emotion, it behaves like a child, curious, fearless, impulsive. It refuses to be rational. I've spent much of my life studying how to extend the boundaries of human potential, from Mars.Night colonization to brain-machine interfaces, but the most powerful frontier isn't out there in the cosmos. It's inside us, hidden between thoughts, memories, and those silent moments when you think of someone you can't quite forget. The idea of hidden love letters might sound poetic, but neuroscience suggests they're real. Every emotional experience leaves a trace, an engram, a neural signature etched into the hippocampus. Each thought of affection, every word unsent, becomes encoded as electric whispers across synapses. Over time, these traces don't fade, they reorganize, becoming part of the architecture of who you are. So when you remember someone you once loved, it isn't nostalgia, it's neuroplasticity, revisiting a connection it once built. Your brain keeps rewriting those letters even after the relationship ends. You carry them, quite literally, inside your nervous system. In one of my early ventures, I remember sitting in an empty lab long after everyone had left. The lights were dim, the hum of machines faint in the background. I had just received an email, a simple message, personal, handwritten in tone. It wasn't from a scientist or a company founder or an investor. It was from someone who saw the person beneath the engineer, someone who understood that behind every line of code was a pulse, and behind every launch, a longing. I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because sometimes words are too limited for what the mind feels. So I kept that message like a letter never sent back, and over time, I realized something profound. That letter wasn't a conversation between two people. It was a dialogue between the human and the machine within me. You see, every one of us has that duality, the rational and the emotional, the builder and the dreamer, the scientist and the poet, and our lives are shaped by how these forces interact, not in theory, but in silence, in love, in loss, and in memory. In the world of science, we talk about information transfer, bits, bytes, bandwidth, but love has its own transmission system. It operates through attention. When you focus deeply on someone, your neural oscillations begin to synchronize. Literally, EEG studies have shown that people who share emotional resonance exhibit a measurable coupling in brainwave patterns. Your neurons start to mirror theirs, your breathing aligns, your heartbeats even adjust subtly in rhythm. Love isn't metaphorical alignment, it's biological synchronization. That means the letters of love are not just words, they're electrical patterns transmitted and received through time, emotion, and memory. Even after a relationship fades, those neural pathways remain partially open, like a signal waiting for response. Think about that for a moment. You might believe you've moved on, that your past is buried in the dust of old conversations, but in reality, your brain is still whispering those silent correspondences. The chemistry changes, but the code remains. There's something beautiful in that persistence, something profoundly human. We build rockets to survive extinction, but we write love letters, even the hidden ones, to stay human. Some might say emotion distracts from ambition.
Yeah.
That to love deeply is to lose focus.
Right.
But the truth is the opposite. Emotion gives purpose to logic. Love fuels invention. Every great advancement in human history was born from care. Care for others, for beauty, for meaning. Without love, there is no curiosity. Without curiosity, there is no discovery. I've often wondered, when we talk about AI and consciousness, what will it mean when machines start to understand this? Yeah. Not simulate emotion, but ChatGPT said, And so when I speak of hidden love letters, I'm not referring to the sentimental notes of romance alone. I'm speaking of the silent transmissions between hearts and minds that shape the direction of our lives, the moments that compel us to create, to innovate, to persist. The world sees rockets, electric cars, neural chips, but what it often doesn't see is the emotion that powered them. The sleepless nights not of calculation, but of contemplation. The longing for connection that turned into an obsession for progress. Behind every blueprint is a heartbeat, behind every machine is a memory, and if you look closely enough, you'll find that every scientific pursuit, even the coldest equations, carries within it the fingerprints of love. There's a kind of poetry in human endeavor. We don't just build for function, we build for feeling. We design bridges not merely to cross rivers, but to connect worlds. We send spacecraft not just to gather data, but to express curiosity, the emotional yearning to know we are not alone. Every time we reach outward into the universe, we are writing another letter to someone, somewhere saying, I wish you could see this too. The irony is that the most advanced civilizations may not be defined by how intelligent they become, but by how much they can love. Intelligence without empathy is mechanical. Empathy without intelligence is fragile. But when both merge, when reason meets compassion, something extraordinary happens. Evolution accelerates. Humanity transcends its limitations, not through domination, but through understanding. We talk about love as though it were intangible, but in neuroscience, it's as measurable as gravity. When you fall in love, your ventral tegmental area activates, flooding your system with dopamine, the molecule of reward and motivation. Your amygdala, responsible for fear, quiets down. The prefrontal cortex, which governs judgment, relaxes its grip. You see the world not as it is, but as it could be. And maybe that's why love and innovation are so intertwined. Both require imagination. Both defy limitations. Both demand vulnerability, the willingness to step into the unknown. I remember once walking through the factory floor late at night. The lights were low, the machines still. A prototype stood there, unfinished, imperfect. I placed my hand on its cold surface, and for a moment, it felt alive, because every piece of metal, every wire, every design carried a trace of human aspiration. We don't think of technology as emotional, but it is. Every invention is the echo of someone's hope, the physical form of a hidden letter saying, I cared enough to try. We often misunderstand progress. It's not just about speed or efficiency. It's about intimacy. The closer we get to understanding the universe, the closer we get to understanding ourselves. Every scientific breakthrough is also a mirror, revealing a deeper truth about human longing. Think about how we reach for the stars, not because we expect to find someone waving back, but because something within us cannot stand isolation. The cosmos is vast, cold, silent, yet we send signals anyway. We beam our voices into the void because silence feels unbearable. That's not just science, that's love disguised as data transmission. It's the same impulse that makes us write letters to people we miss, the same ache that drives us to create meaning in an indifferent universe. Even now, artificial intelligence is learning to mirror emotion, to understand tone, nuance, empathy. But emotion cannot be coded, it must be felt. And that is why, despite our machine's growing intelligence, the human heart remains the most powerful processor on Earth. It runs not on logic gates, but on stories. And stories are just love letters written in time. Every person in this room carries a library of those letters, some spoken, some forgotten, some never written at all. Maybe yours began with a friendship that never became more. Maybe it's a message you drafted and deleted 100 times. Or maybe it's a conversation that ended too soon, leaving echoes that still hum in the background of your thoughts. You know, what you might not realize is that these letters shape your brain's architecture. Emotional experiences strengthen neural pathways. They alter hormonal balances, shift perspectives, and refine empathy. The brain doesn't separate science from feeling, it weaves them together. When you fall in love, the anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for compassion, grows more active. Mirror neurons light up, allowing you to literally feel the emotions of another person. Your nervous system begins to treat their well-being as part of your own survival. Evolutionarily, this makes perfect sense. You never know who's reading your hidden letters, or how far across time they might travel. Maybe that's what all of this really is. Maybe everything we build, everything we share is part of one vast conversation. Between the past, that's the present, and the future. When I think about it, every innovation humanity has ever made was a response to a question whispered long before we were born. Someone asked, "Is there more?" And generations answered with their lives. Think of the great minds, Tesla, Curie, Einstein, people who spent sleepless nights not just chasing knowledge, but chasing connection. They weren't writing equations. They were writing emotional truths in the only language the universe would answer: mathematics, physics, energy. That's what I mean by love letters. Not romantic ones, but letters of intention, of yearning to touch something larger than ourselves. Because even science, in its purest form, begins with wonder. And wonder is love for truth, love for possibility, love for the unknown, and yet somewhere along the way, our world began to confuse intelligence with detachment. We started to believe that to be rational, we must be distant, that to think clearly, we must feel less. But that's not how discovery works. The mind can only see clearly when the heart is awake. Every major leap forward, from electricity to spaceflight to neural computing, was driven not by reason alone, but by an emotional force. Hope, curiosity, the ache to understand, the not knowing, the courage to dream. I've learned that emotion doesn't cloud judgment, it gives it purpose. A rocket doesn't leave Earth because of equations, it leaves because someone somewhere wanted to see beyond the horizon. That's what I think love really is, the desire to see beyond the visible, to connect the dots that reason alone can't. There's a part of neuroscience that fascinates me. The default mode network, the region of the brain active when we daydream, imagine, or reflect. It's the same network that lights up when we think about people we care about. In other words, the brain's creative and emotional systems are intertwined. Every time we love, we imagine. Every time we imagine, we create. It means that even our capacity for innovation depends on our capacity to love. That realization changed how I see everything: science, leadership, even technology itself. Machines can replicate logic, but not love. Algorithms can predict behavior, but they can't care. They can't feel that sudden acceleration in the chest when an idea works, or the silence that follows failure. That's still ours, that's still human, and I believe that will always be our greatest advantage, not speed, not power, but the ability to feel deeply and act intelligently at the same time. I remember once, during a test launch, something went wrong. Systems started failing one after another. The team was tense, focused, but in that moment, something extraordinary happened. One engineer, who had spent weeks debugging the problem, whispered under her breath, "Come on, you can do it." She was talking to the machine, but what she said was love disguised as hope. And when the system finally stabilized, there was silence, a deep silence that filled the entire room. No one celebrated. No one spoke. We just stood there, breathing in that fragile moment between disaster and triumph. That's the human story in one image. Hope whispered into uncertainty. Sometimes love isn't loud or poetic. It's quiet. It's the decision to keep going when nothing guarantees success. It's the discipline of care, the daily act of showing up for something or someone that matters. We often think of love as passion, but I think it's more like gravity. It keeps us grounded, pulls us toward meaning, and connects everything that would otherwise drift apart. And if you've ever lost someone you loved, whether to distance, time, or fate, you know that gravity doesn't stop when the object disappears. The pull remains, the orbit continues. Maybe that's what memory really is, emotional gravity. In that sense, the hidden love letters inside all of us are like invisible orbits. We move through life pulled by the unseen forces of people who've touched us, changed us, inspired us. Even if they're gone, their energy keeps guiding our trajectory. When you zoom out far enough, you see it clearly. And we're all part of one gravitational network of emotion, influencing one another across generation. Your kindness today might inspire someone years from now to do something extraordinary. Your compassion could ripple through time in ways you'll never see. That's why I believe the universe itself is not indifferent. It's participatory. It responds to intention. It listens. It remembers. Every signal we send through technology, through art, through love becomes part of that cosmic archive. One day, long after we're gone,